Late in 1986, on Staten Island, James Hydell thought the men stopping him were regular NYPD detectives carrying out another routine police check. Yet within minutes, that traffic stop became something very different after Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa put him in handcuffs, shoved him into a trunk, then delivered him alive to Anthony Gaspipe Casso in Brooklyn. By the time Casso finished questioning him, Hydell was gone forever, while the men responsible still carried badges, still drove police vehicles, still looked like law enforcement to everybody watching. That was the kind of reach Gaspipe Casso had when New York was packed with gangsters, hustlers, union rackets, corrupt insiders, and people making fortunes in the shadows. To understand how one man got that kind of pull, we need to go back to South Brooklyn. Long before Anthony Casso had detectives working for him, before federal agents filled case files with his name, he was just another kid, growing up near the South Brooklyn waterfront after being born there on May 21st, 1942, in a neighborhood where organized crime blended into everyday life so completely that many young boys barely recognized the difference. His father, Michael Casso, worked as a longshoreman along the docks, although stories about burglaries followed him through the neighborhood, which gave young Anthony an early look at how respectable work sometimes overlapped with street hustles. Around those same streets stood men who carried influence without uniforms or public titles, while one of the most important among them was Salvatore Calimbrano, Anthony's godfather, a Genovese capo regime whose presence exposed the boy to made men long before he understood what that status really meant. By the time Anthony was old enough to notice how people reacted whenever certain men entered a room, he was already absorbing lessons about power, respect, money, and silence without anybody formally teaching him. That environment pushed him toward the street faster than it pushed him toward anything else. So after dropping out of school at 16, he spent more time around social clubs, pool halls, neighborhood corners, and dockside hangouts where wise guys gathered. While many teenagers wasted afternoons chasing entertainment, Anthony practiced shooting with a .22 caliber rifle, spent hours on rooftops hunting birds, and then earned extra cash killing hawks for local pigeon keepers who wanted their flocks protected. Those jobs paid little, yet they sharpened skills that would matter later, especially patience, observation, and accuracy. At the same time, he became associated with the South Brooklyn Boys, a local crew filled with young Italian-American kids who fought rivals, stole property, stripped vehicles, and constantly searched for opportunities that promised money or reputation. As Anthony's reputation grew, arrests started arriving almost as frequently as new opportunities. Although consequences rarely lasted very low in ring, 1958, he was arrested after a violent street brawl involving a rival Irish-American gang, while his father reportedly came to the station hoping the experience would scare him straight. That effort failed quickly. Then matters became more serious in 1961 when Anthony was arrested for attempted murder after another violent confrontation. Yet despite the severity of that accusation, the victim refused to identify him, which caused the case to collapse before it reached a meaningful conclusion. The pattern repeated itself again during 1962 after a bookmaking conviction brought only a brief jail sentence, then returned years later through additional arrests involving firearms, assaults, narcotics activity, and a 1972 bank robbery investigation where witnesses once again lost their willingness to cooperate. While those encounters kept introducing Anthony to police files, another relationship was quietly shaping his future much more than any courtroom ever would. Christopher "Christy Tick" Furnari ran the Lucchese family's 19th hole crew out of Brooklyn, and unlike law enforcement officers who saw trouble, Furnari saw potential. He recognized that Anthony possessed qualities useful inside organized crime, especially aggression, discipline, loyalty to the right people, and a willingness to carry out unpleasant assignments without hesitation. Once Furnari pulled him closer, Anthony moved into loan shark collections, gambling operations, burglaries, truck hijackings, street enforcement, and whatever other work needed handling. Instead of viewing crime as isolated opportunities, he began learning how entire systems generated revenue through fear, influence, and organization. Somewhere inside Furnari's orbit, Anthony met another rising figure named Vittorio Vic Amuso, whose personality contrasted sharply with his own despite producing remarkably similar results. Whereas Anthony could be loud, forceful, and openly intimidating, Amuso carried himself more quietly, though people around him understood that silence did not mean weakness. The partnership that developed between them was not built around friendship in the traditional sense, since neither man seemed interested in sentimental loyalty, but both recognized competence when they saw it. Together they worked robberies, collections, gambling schemes, and increasingly profitable ventures, while each learned how the other operated under pressure. Years later, many investigators would describe them as one of the most dangerous partnerships in New York organized crime, although at this stage they were simply ambitious street operators climbing through the ranks. As those years unfolded, Anthony learned something more valuable than any burglary technique or gambling racket formula, since every dropped case reinforced the same lesson from another angle. Witnesses disappeared, memories changed, victims stopped cooperating, and prosecutors repeatedly watched cases weaken once fear entered the equation. Whether the charge involved attempted murder, bank robbery, bookmaking, or firearms violations, the outcome often looked remarkably similar whenever somebody decided speaking carried greater risk than remaining silent. Long before Anthony Casso owned cops, ordered contract killings, manipulated entire crews, or eventually turned government witness himself, he learned the principle that would guide much of his rise through organized crime, which was that fear could erase testimony faster than loyalty ever could. As Anthony Casso moved deeper into Christopher Fornari's circle during the 1970s, the partnership with Vic Amuso started producing something much bigger than ordinary street rackets, since both men were now surrounded by specialists whose skills could generate serious money without attracting the attention that came with public violence. Fornari's 19th Hole crew gave them access to experienced operators, while Casso helped assemble a team that eventually became known as the Bypass Gang, a burglary outfit built less like a street crew and more like a professional operation. Dominic the Butcher Costa brought safe-cracking expertise. James Jimmy the Greek Corrales understood alarm systems. Earl Brown contributed locksmith knowledge, while George Zappola and George Georgie Neck Zappola provided enforcement and security whenever jobs became risky. Together they developed a system where every participant handled a specific task, which allowed them to attack targets that ordinary thieves never would have attempted. Instead of smashing windows or sticking up stores, the Bypass Gang focused on preparation, which meant studying buildings for weeks before making a move. Crew members posed as repairmen, bribed janitors, copied keys, examined alarm panels, rented neighboring properties, then mapped entry routes through walls, ceilings, and floors. On some jobs, they leased office space directly above jewelry stores, spending days drilling through concrete while city traffic masked the noise below. During other operations, they rented storefronts beside banks, then worked through shared walls until reaching vaults from angles security designers never anticipated. Once inside, they relied on Costa, Brown, and other specialists to open safes methodically, allowing the crew to leave with diamonds, cash, jewelry, bonds, and valuables before anyone realized the burglary had occurred. One operation involved a jeweler near Manhattan's Diamond District, where the crew established space above the target, drilled downward through the structure, entered the vault after business hours, then removed so many stones that crew members later joked about needing wheelbarrows. Another job targeted a bank where alarm-protected doors became irrelevant after the team entered through an adjacent property, eventually drilling through vault steel from the side, rather than confronting the security system directly. Across New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island, and surrounding areas, similar scores continued piling up until authorities eventually estimated the Bypass Gang had stolen more than $100 million in cash and valuables. That figure transformed Casso's standing completely, since he became wealthy long before reaching the highest levels of the Lucchese family hierarchy. While other gangsters chased individual scores, Gaspipe was helping operate a machine that generated fortunes repeatedly. Yet the money changed something inside him, since every successful burglary made him less interested in sharing profits fairly with the people helping create them. Associates later described a man who constantly searched for hidden money, missing percentages, or opportunities to take an additional cut from partners who already kicked up their share. If stolen jewelry could be sold privately, he sold it privately. If a payout could be reduced through invented expenses, he invented the expenses. If valuable merchandise disappeared before crew members counted it, nobody challenged him openly, partly because his reputation for violence had already started growing alongside his bank account. The same operation that built trust among specialists was gradually teaching Casso that fear could be more profitable than partnership. That mindset became increasingly dangerous for anyone working around him, especially once suspicion entered the picture. Among the people caught in that atmosphere was John Otto Hydell, a forger and safecracker connected to Casso's world who eventually attracted unwanted attention. Whether the concern involved hidden money, loose talk, or perceived disloyalty, mattered less than the fact that Gaspipe believed something was wrong. Once that belief settled into his mind, friendship, history, and past earnings offered very little protection. Hydell's situation revealed a side of Casso that would become much more visible later, since he increasingly treated associates as potential threats instead of valuable assets. The search for Hydell also introduced another element quietly entering the story long before most people recognized its significance. At some point, assistance came from two NYPD detectives named Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, whose names would later become inseparable from some of the darkest chapters connected to Casso's rise. Their involvement remained hidden from most outsiders, yet they reportedly helped locate Hydell after suspicion fell on him. Once Hydell disappeared, his body never resurfaced, while questions surrounding his fate lingered behind closed doors. For people watching carefully, however, the lesson was already becoming clear, since Gaspipe's influence was expanding beyond mob crews into places where badges and police databases could become tools. By the end of the decade, Anthony Casso had accumulated money, connections, experienced burglars, and a growing reputation for getting results whenever profit was involved. At the same time, he had begun developing another habit that would follow him throughout the rest of his career, since every successful score eventually produced a second opportunity hidden inside the first. While most people focused on stealing from banks, jewelers, or businesses, Gaspipe increasingly looked toward the men standing beside him, calculating how much more could be taken from them once the original job was already finished. That lesson stayed with him long after the bypass gang expanded, and it eventually became one of the defining features of his entire rise through organized crime. By the time Anthony Casso finished building wealth through the bypass gang, events unfolding elsewhere in New York were opening doors that no burglary crew could ever unlock. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano stepped out of a car outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, expecting another business meeting, yet gunmen appeared before he reached the entrance and cut him down in the street alongside several associates. The killing immediately changed the atmosphere across organized crime circles, not only because a powerful boss had been murdered, but also because the hit happened without the approval that traditionally protected the structure from open warfare. As news spread through social clubs, gambling operations, construction rackets, and union circles, one name quickly moved into the spotlight, while John Gotti emerged from the chaos as the man positioned to benefit from Castellano's death. For Anthony Casso and Vic Amuso, the shooting was not merely another headline involving another family, since the fallout quickly reached men connected to the Lucchese leadership. Frank DeCicco, one of the key figures around Gotti, reportedly approached Casso before the assassination, while support was being gathered among influential figures who might accept the plan. Years later, conflicting accounts emerged about what Casso actually said during those conversations, while Sammy Gravano would later describe support that Casso himself sometimes portrayed differently. Whatever words were exchanged behind closed doors, the reality outside those rooms remained unchanged after Castellano was buried, because a boss had been removed without commission approval, which left several powerful figures demanding a response. Among those figures were Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo of the Lucchese family and Vincent the Chin Gigante of the Genovese family, both of whom viewed the killing as a dangerous challenge to the existing order. Their anger soon produced plans of their own, while Frank DeCicco and John Gotti became targets rather than victors in the eyes of certain leaders. The assignment eventually landed with Casso and Amuso, who were selected to help organize retaliation designed to remove the men responsible. This development marked an important shift in Gaspipe's career, since he was no longer operating primarily inside burglary networks, hijacking crews, or local rackets. Instead, he was now participating in decisions capable of affecting the balance of power across New York's most influential criminal organizations. The operation that followed reached its climax on April 13, 1986, outside a Brooklyn social club where Frank DeCicco expected to meet John Gotti. Beneath a parked Buick Electra sat explosives prepared to do far more damage than a traditional street shooting. Herbert Pate handled the detonation, while Anthony Casso, Vic Amuso, and Robert Amuso monitored developments nearby. At the last moment, Gotti failed to appear at the meeting, which altered the outcome dramatically while leaving the bomb itself unchanged. When the explosion ripped through the area, DeCicco was killed. Another passenger was severely injured, and one of the most significant revenge attempts of the era produced only a partial result. Although Gotti survived, the message remained unmistakable, while Gaspipe's name became attached to an operation involving bosses, underbosses, car bombs, and commission-level disputes rather than neighborhood score settling. What makes that period especially important is the way multiple worlds began overlapping around Casso at the same time. While one side of his life involved Italian-American power struggles connected to Castellano, Godi, De Chico, Corallo, and Gigante, another opportunity was developing along the Brighton Beach waterfront among Russian organized crime figures who controlled enormous amounts of money. One of the most important among them was Marat Balagula, an immigrant kingpin whose gasoline tax schemes generated staggering profits through shell companies designed to dodge tax obligations. Those operations moved huge volumes of fuel through layers of paper corporations, allowing participants to collect taxes that were never properly paid to government authorities. The profits became so large that multiple criminal groups wanted a piece of the action. Balagula's growing wealth attracted unwanted attention from several directions, including pressure linked to Michael Franzese and Colombo interests operating around gasoline distribution. Seeking protection, Balagula approached Christopher Fernari and the Lucchese side, where Anthony Casso was already becoming an increasingly important figure. Agreements followed, arrangements were made, and a street tax system emerged that allowed money to flow while reducing conflict between competing groups. For Gaspipe, the arrangement opened a new revenue stream while also expanding his influence beyond traditional mafia circles. The same man who once robbed vaults through concrete walls now found himself connected to international money moving through shell companies, fuel networks, and Russian organized crime contacts. Not everybody accepted the arrangement peacefully, however, and one of the biggest problems arrived in the form of Vladimir Reznikov, a violent Brighton Beach figure who wanted a share of Balagula's profits. Before confronting Balagula directly, Reznikov had already built a reputation for extreme aggression, including an attack involving an AK-style weapon fired into Balagula's office. The conflict escalated further when Reznikov entered the Rasputin nightclub, carrying a pistol, and demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars while threatening Balagula's future operations. The encounter reportedly left Balagula terrified enough to seek immediate help, while the dispute quickly landed on Anthony Casso's desk. Rather than negotiating endlessly, Gaspipe chose a solution that fit his reputation far better than diplomacy. A meeting was arranged under the appearance of resolving the dispute, while Joseph Testa and Anthony Center prepared to handle matters once Reznikov arrived. Expecting money instead of an ambush, Reznikov showed up believing he would collect what he had demanded. What followed ended his involvement permanently, since Testa approached and shot him dead before he could leave the area alive. The killing restored Balagula's confidence, strengthened the relationship between Russian and Lucchese interests, and added another body to a growing list of people removed after crossing paths with Anthony Casso's network. Viewed together, the De Secco bombing and the Reznikov killing reveal how dramatically Gaspipe's role had changed within only a few years. Whether the problem involved a Gambino underboss connected to a mafia power struggle or a Russian gangster threatening a profitable arrangement, the solution increasingly pointed toward the same small group of operators. By the late 1980s, Anthony Casso was no longer simply a thief who specialized in vaults and alarm systems, since he had become something much more valuable to the people around him. Whenever money, influence, territory, or survival were placed at risk, Gaspipe developed a reputation for making the obstacle disappear, which only increased his importance while pulling him toward even larger dangers waiting ahead. Back in part 1, James Hydell disappeared after what looked like an ordinary police stop, although by now it should be clear that the men who grabbed him were not acting like detectives that day. The deeper Anthony Casso moved into powerful circles, the more he realized that information could be worth more than gunmen, since knowing who was talking, who was being watched, or who was preparing a move often meant the difference between survival and a funeral. That realization eventually produced one of the most shocking partnerships in organized crime history when two active NYPD detectives, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, quietly became part of Gaspipe's operation. What made the arrangement even more dangerous was the fact that neither man worked from the streets looking inward, since both sat inside law enforcement itself, giving Casso access to information that ordinary gangsters could only dream about obtaining. The bridge connecting those worlds was Burton Kaplan, a businessman who functioned as the middleman carrying money, messages, requests, and instructions between Casso and the detectives. Through Kaplan, monthly payments reportedly reached Eppolito and Caracappa, while valuable intelligence flowed back in the opposite direction. License plate searches, surveillance details, witness information, confidential investigations, and names connected to ongoing cases gradually became available to Gaspipe whenever he needed them. The arrangement transformed the detectives into what Casso later called his crystal ball, since they could show him dangers before they arrived and expose people who believed law enforcement was protecting them. For a man already obsessed with control, that kind of access was almost impossible to resist. One of the first major examples involved James Hydell, whose disappearance introduced this story. Hydell was connected to the Gambino side through Daniel Marino, while tensions surrounding an attempted hit against Casso placed several people under suspicion. Gaspipe wanted answers, yet obtaining those answers through traditional channels would have taken time and carried risks. Instead, Hydell was reportedly located, intercepted, handcuffed, and delivered alive through a process that blurred every line separating organized crime from law enforcement. Once he reached Casso, questioning followed, information was extracted, and Hydell vanished permanently. His body never surfaced, while the message spread quietly through criminal circles that some people could no longer trust police encounters to remain police encounters. If Hydell demonstrated how dangerous the arrangement could be for someone involved in organized crime, the story of Nicholas Guido showed that the consequences could reach innocent people as well. Casso wanted information on a Gambino associate named Nicholas Guido, yet somewhere inside the chain of intelligence, a catastrophic mistake entered the process. The detectives reportedly identified the wrong man, confusing the intended target with an innocent Brooklyn telephone repairman who happened to share the same name. That error might have seemed small on paper, although it became fatal on Christmas Day 1986 when gunmen arrived and opened fire on the wrong Nicholas Guido. Unlike many people appearing throughout this story, Guido was not a mobster, not a government witness, not an informant, and not a rival gangster. He was simply a man whose name matched another man's name, which turned him into a victim of a system that no longer cared enough to distinguish between them. The killing of Guido exposed something important about Casso's expanding network, since the machine he built could destroy people who had no connection whatsoever to the conflicts driving it. While gangsters often justified violence through rules, rivalries, betrayals, or business disputes, Guido's death fit none of those categories. Instead, it revealed what happened when unchecked power collided with bad information inside a structure where nobody slowed down long enough to verify the target. Even years later, that murder remained one of the clearest examples showing how far the arrangement had drifted from anything resembling law enforcement. A badge that should have protected innocent citizens had become part of the mechanism that endangered them. Around the same period, another target entered the picture through Eddie Lino, a respected Gambino captain whose name surfaced during ongoing tensions connected to earlier power struggles. Lino believed he was driving normally along the Belt Parkway when what appeared to be a routine police stop interrupted his trip. The scene looked familiar enough that he reportedly pulled over without expecting immediate danger, which made what happened next even more effective. Instead of receiving a citation or answering questions, Lino was executed after being isolated during a stop that carried the appearance of legitimate police activity. Once again, the uniform itself became part of the weapon, while Gaspipe benefited from access unavailable to almost anyone else operating in organized crime. The list continued growing through cases involving Bruno Fasciolo, a Lucchese soldier who eventually found himself accused of talking too much. Suspicion inside Casso's world often moved faster than proof, which meant people could become targets long before certainty existed. Fasciolo was murdered and left with a canary stuffed in his mouth, a symbol designed to warn others about the consequences of speaking. The display fit perfectly inside a culture obsessed with silence, yet it also reflected Gaspipe's increasingly aggressive approach toward internal threats. Loyalty mattered less than perception, while the appearance of disloyalty could become a death sentence all by itself. That same mindset connects directly back to John Otto Hydell, whose disappearance began earlier when questions emerged regarding hidden money, loyalty, and trust. By then, the detectives were already helping locate people Casso wanted found, which meant earners working within his own circles faced dangers from directions they never fully understood. Hydell was not hunted by a rival family invading territory or a competing crew chasing revenge. Instead, he became entangled in suspicions generated inside his own world, then vanished after those suspicions attracted enough attention. Stories like Hydell's demonstrated that Gaspipe was no longer using intelligence merely to defend himself from enemies. He was increasingly using it to monitor, discipline, and eliminate people standing beside him. Taken together, these cases reveal why the phrase crystal ball carried so much meaning for Anthony Casso. The detectives helped him identify threats, uncover investigations, locate targets, and avoid dangers that might have destroyed less connected figures. At the same time, however, access to that much information created its own problem, since every report introduced another possible traitor, another suspected informant, another hidden enemy, or another reason for concern. As the years passed, Gaspipe became richer, more influential, and harder to reach, yet those same advantages slowly fed a level of paranoia that would reshape everything around him. A man who learns too many secrets eventually starts believing secrets exist everywhere, and that belief was already beginning to change Anthony Casso into something even more dangerous than the ambitious gangster who first entered Christopher Fornari's orbit years earlier. By the late 1980s, Anthony Casso had already survived street wars, major burglaries, federal investigations, internal betrayals, and high-level mafia disputes. Although the biggest opportunity of his life arrived when the old leadership of the Lucchese family started falling under federal pressure. The commission trial was tearing through organized crime leadership across New York, while Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo knew the era of ruling from the street was coming to an end. As prison became increasingly unavoidable, Corallo needed a successor capable of protecting the family's interests while maintaining stability during a dangerous transition. According to multiple accounts, Corallo considered Anthony Casso for the top position because Gaspipe had already proven himself as an earner, organizer, strategist, and enforcer. Yet Casso understood something many ambitious mobsters ignored, which was that the title of boss often attracted federal attention faster than any other position. Rather than placing himself directly under the spotlight, Casso supported Vittorio Vicamuso for the boss position while positioning himself beside the throne instead of sitting on it. On paper, Amuso became boss, while Casso initially served as consigliere before later becoming underboss. In practice, however, important decisions frequently involved both men, while captains quickly learned that access to Amuso rarely mattered unless Casso supported the same outcome. The arrangement protected Gaspipe from some of the visibility attached to official leadership, yet it allowed him to influence nearly every significant issue affecting the organization. By this stage, the partnership that started years earlier under Christopher Fornari had evolved into the most powerful alliance inside the Lucchese family. What made the structure especially effective was that Amuso handled the public image of leadership, while Casso controlled much of the machinery, generating money behind the scenes. That machinery stretched across nearly every profitable corner of New York. Carting companies operating throughout Long Island paid for labor peace, protection, and favorable treatment, while airport freight businesses around JFK generated steady revenue through labor influence and transportation arrangements. Garment district businesses continued paying protection money, gambling operations produced reliable weekly income, and vending machine routes supplied another stream of cash moving quietly upward. Construction projects became especially valuable because concrete suppliers, labor contracts, trucking companies, and contractor disputes all created opportunities for intervention. Whenever a developer wanted problems solved, permits expedited, strikes avoided, or materials delivered without interruption, somebody connected to organized crime usually appeared nearby looking for a percentage. One example involved George Calicatas, whose Astoria-based gambling and loan sharking operations reportedly generated substantial payments that eventually reached Casso's circle. Another lucrative arrangement involved a Coney Island contractor takeover that reportedly produced roughly $600,000 for Casso and Amuso. A separate operation involving stolen steel from a West Side Highway project reportedly created an additional $800,000 windfall. None of these deals alone explain the scale of wealth flowing toward Gaspipe, although together they reveal how multiple revenue streams continuously merge into one enormous financial pipeline. Unlike many gangsters who depended on a single racket, Casso collected money from transportation, labor, construction, gambling, loan sharking, protection schemes, freight operations, and countless smaller arrangements spread across the city. The deeper he moved into leadership, however, the more frequently associates noticed money disappearing before distributions reached the people expecting them. Soldiers kicked up earnings believing leadership would take an agreed percentage, yet numerous accounts later suggested that Casso often found ways to take extra portions beyond official shares. Sometimes expenses appeared unexpectedly after a profitable score. Other times merchandise disappeared before final accounting occurred. In some situations, side deals generated income that never reached official family records at all. The irony sitting at the center of this story becomes impossible to miss here, because the man demanding absolute loyalty from subordinates was increasingly treating those same subordinates as opportunities for additional profit. That behavior created growing resentment beneath the surface, although very few people felt comfortable confronting him directly. By then, everybody knew the stories involving John Otto Hydell, Bruno Facciolo, James Hydell, and others who found themselves in trouble after attracting suspicion. Fear often accomplished what authority alone could not, which meant complaints rarely traveled very far. Captains continued earning, soldiers continued kicking up, and associates continued working, although many privately understood that the financial rules seemed to change whenever Gaspipe stood to benefit. The family remained enormously profitable, yet trust was steadily becoming one of its scarcest commodities. While many of the men earning money for the organization still lived relatively ordinary lives compared to their bosses, Casso's lifestyle increasingly reflected the wealth accumulating around him. He maintained expensive properties, enjoyed luxury unavailable to most members, and built a comfortable domestic life around his wife, Lillian Del Duca. Large homes in places such as Mill Basin symbolized how far he had traveled from the South Brooklyn streets, had where he first learned organized crime. Yet that success also created distance between leadership and the people risking arrest, violence, and financial loss every day to keep the machine running. The further Gaspipe moved away from ordinary earners, the easier it became for him to view them as assets rather than partners. One incident involving an architect illustrated how dangerous that mindset had become. What started as a business disagreement connected to work performed for Casso reportedly escalated into discussions far more serious than a normal payment dispute should ever produce. In another environment, lawyers, accountants, or civil courts might have handled the conflict. Inside Gaspipe's world, however, financial disagreements could quickly become questions of loyalty, respect, and punishment. That willingness to treat ordinary business problems as potential life or death matters revealed how deeply suspicion had embedded itself into his thinking. By the start of the 1990s, Anthony Casso occupied one of the most powerful positions in organized crime without officially holding the highest title. He controlled enormous revenue streams, influenced major decisions, possessed corrupt law enforcement contacts, maintained powerful alliances, and operated beside the boss rather than beneath him. Yet the same qualities that helped him reach that position were beginning to undermine everything he had built. Every new source of income created another person he suspected of stealing. Every successful operation created another potential informant. Every trusted associate eventually became someone worth watching. As money continued flowing upward, paranoia spread just as quickly, transforming the Lucchese family into a pressure cooker where fear increasingly replaced loyalty as the glue holding everything together. By 1990, Anthony Casso had spent years building an empire through violence, corruption, racketeering, and fear. Yet the pressure now coming toward the Lucchese family looked different from anything he had faced before. Federal investigators were targeting the Windows case, a massive scheme involving New York City Housing Authority window replacement contracts, where organized crime figures manipulated bids, controlled contractors, and extracted profits from public projects. As indictments approached, Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso disappeared underground rather than face immediate arrest, leaving others to manage the family while they operated through messages, intermediaries, and hidden meetings. One of the men carrying those responsibilities was Alphonse Little Al Darko, a longtime mob figure who accepted the role of acting boss while the leadership remained in hiding. Darko understood organized crime better than most people ever would, which meant he was not shocked by violence, extortion, or murder orders. What began troubling him was the scale of suspicion spreading from Casso and Amuso, since nearly every setback produced another target list. The atmosphere became even worse after Peter Fat Pete Chiodo entered the picture. Chiodo had been one of the family's biggest earners, while his influence stretched across labor rackets, construction interests, and lucrative operations generating enormous profits. When Chiodo pleaded guilty in conviction to the Windows case, Casso immediately interpreted the move as betrayal rather her than legal strategy, which placed one of the family's most valuable members directly in danger. That decision exploded into violence on May 8, 1991, when Chiodo stopped at a gas station in Staten Island. Gunmen appeared and opened fire, striking him roughly 12 times, while bullets tore through his body. Under almost any circumstances, that attack should have ended in death, yet Chiodo somehow survived despite catastrophic injuries. For most mafia leaders, the failure of the assassination attempt would have been bad enough. For Casso, however, survival created a larger problem because a wounded target could still cooperate with authorities. Instead of stepping back, pressure increased even further after threats expanded beyond Chiodo himself and moved toward his relatives. That shift became a turning point for many people watching from inside the family. Chiodo's wife became a target of intimidation, while his sister Patricia Capozalo was later shot and wounded during an attack clearly connected to the effort to pressure him. Around the same period, Frank Signorino ended up dead inside a car trunk after becoming entangled in the widening internal chaos. Even Chiodo's elderly grandmother became part of the campaign when her garage was burned, sending a message that age, distance, and innocence no longer provided protection. Those actions crossed lines that many mob figures still considered important, which meant fear was no longer being used merely against rivals. It was now being directed at entire families. The same paranoia soon collided with another major problem involving Anthony Tumac Axaturo and the powerful New Jersey faction. For years, Axaturo's crew generated millions through loan sharking, gambling, labor rackets, and business interests, although growing tribute demands from Casso and Amuso created increasing resentment. Axaturo resisted surrendering larger portions of his earnings, while other New Jersey members questioned why leadership expected more money despite contributing little to those operations. Rather than negotiating, Casso and Amuso responded with what became known as the Whack Jersey Order, effectively placing an entire faction under threat. Names such as Michael Papadio, Anthony Delapi, John Petrocelli, and others surfaced within discussions involving potential killings, while even relatives became part of the intimidation strategy. For Darko, the situation became impossible to ignore after he learned that leadership was increasingly viewing its own people as enemies. The breaking point arrived when he believed he had become a potential target himself. Instead of waiting for a murder team to appear, Darko contacted FBI agent Robert Marston and entered protective custody with his family. His decision shocked organized crime circles throughout New York because he became the first acting boss of a New York mafia family to cooperate publicly with federal authorities. By that stage, the greatest danger facing the Lucchese family no longer came from prosecutors building cases in federal offices. The real threat was now coming from its own leadership, which had become so consumed by suspicion that it was dismantling the organization from within. While Darko, Chiodo, and other insiders moved toward cooperation, Anthony Casso spent the early 1990s living as a fugitive. He moved through safe houses across Brooklyn, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, relying on payphones, trusted associates, coded communications, and loyal contacts to remain hidden from federal agents. During that period, he maintained connections with his mistress Rosemarie Bellotti, while his wife Lillian Del Duca remained part of his separate home life. Stories later circulated about hidden tunnels and panic rooms connected to locations he used, although those accounts remained part of street lore rather than firmly established fact. What is certain is that Casso continued running family affairs through intermediaries while searching constantly for ways to stay ahead of investigators. His position weakened dramatically after Vic Amuso was arrested in July 1991. Rumors later emerged suggesting that information leaks may have contributed to Amuso's capture, while some associates suspected Casso played a role, although accounts remained disputed. Whether true or not, the damage was immediate because Amuso came to believe that Casso could no longer be trusted. The partnership that had helped shape the Lucchese family for years effectively collapsed, while Amuso stripped him of authority and treated him as an enemy rather than an ally. For a man who had spent decades surviving through relationships, that isolation removed one of the few remaining protections still available to him. Federal agents finally caught up with Casso in January 1993 at a ranch house in Mount Olive, New Jersey. During the arrest, investigators recovered weapons, cash, lists of telephone booth contacts, and other materials connected to his years as a fugitive. According to later accounts, Casso even attempted to offer a $1 million bribe in hopes of escaping the situation. That effort failed, leaving him in custody while prosecutors prepared cases, carrying enough prison time to ensure he would never regain his former position. Faced with overwhelming evidence, growing witness cooperation, and collapsing alliances, Gaspipe made a decision that would permanently redefine his legacy. In March 1994, Anthony Casso agreed to cooperate with the government. The same man who had ordered murders over suspected informants now entered witness protection and began identifying more than 50 mob figures. His information exposed long-hidden crimes, revealed details about the mafia cops Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, and provided investigators with valuable insight into organized crime operations. Yet his cooperation quickly became complicated by exaggerations, personal grudges, disputed claims, and outright falsehoods that damaged his credibility. prosecutors eventually concluded that Casso could not be trusted completely, while Judge Jack Weinstein later became involved in proceedings that helped remove him from witness protection. By 1997, his cooperation agreement had effectively collapsed, leaving him to face a sentence totaling 455 years. The aftermath stretched far beyond his own prison cell. Darko and Chodo continued assisting federal authorities, which weakened the Lucchese family substantially. Anthony Exetero's New Jersey faction never recovered its former position. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were eventually convicted in 2006 for murders and corruption connected to their criminal partnership. Vica Musso remained imprisoned for life, while many figures once protected by secrecy found themselves exposed through years of investigations and testimony. Throughout organized crime circles, Anthony Casso's name gradually became associated less with power than with betrayal. When he died on December 15, 2020, in federal custody at Tucson, Arizona, after complications related to COVID-19, he had spent 27 years behind bars watching the empire he helped build disappear piece by piece. Looking back to James Hydell's disappearance in 1986 reveals the irony running through the entire story, because the man who once had corrupt detectives delivering victims directly into his hands eventually survived by delivering names to the same government he spent his life fighting. In the end, Anthony Gaspipe Casso did not fall because rivals outgunned him or because law enforcement suddenly became smarter. He fell after years of suspicion convinced him that nobody could be trusted, until eventually he became exactly the kind of informant he once hunted.